Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is General-Segolodi. I am the author of Pro-Mortalism, a study of existential antinatalism and existential pro-mortalism. The book is now available on Amazon in both Kindle and paperback format. I will leave the Amazon link down in the comment section. You can also access it on my website, which you can find through the link in the channel description. This video is the second and last part of a video series in which I debunk the theory known as generic subjective continuity, or as it is sometimes abbreviated, GSC. In this video, we're going to present two more arguments, a second and a third argument against GSC. So, before we get into these arguments, I would first like to expand upon a minor point that I had brought up back in part 1. It was about the fact that there isn't any supposedly common misconception among atheists about there being an experience of eternal darkness in a black void after a person dies. Even if someone explicitly mentions something about a peaceful oblivion, I stated that this is generally not meant to be taken literally. Adherents of GSC, however, stubbornly remain obsessed with repeating this accusation. They even go as far as to state that if you believe that consciousness disappears after death, then that still implies that you believe in the eternal dark void. So essentially, they are trying to equate a lack of experience with an experience of nothingness. So in the last video, I proved how a lack of experience is not the same as an experience of nothingness. In this video, we're going to do something a little different. I'm going to show that instead of rejecting the atheist view on death, it is actually more sensible for believers of GSC to agree with it. This is because if they continue to insist that the atheist view on death is wrong, that actually exposes a contradiction within GSC that causes the theory to quickly fall apart, and this can be easily demonstrated. So within the image that is now in front of you, you can see two horizontal lines that go from one end of the screen to the other. So these horizontal lines, these are axes. They represent time, and each line represents time in a different universe. So the line at the top represents time in an atheist universe. The line at the bottom shows time in a GSC type of universe. So as you can see, both of them contain a character named Thomas. That would be Thomas Clark. Underneath his name, you can see a short vertical line. So this line represents his consciousness. The width of this line represents his lifespan, right? How long he lived. So in both universes, we can see that Thomas was born at some point, and then at another point in the future, he died. So we can actually see what happens to Thomas after he dies in each universe. Now we can see that in the atheist universe, after Thomas dies, basically nothing happens. His death is followed by the absence of his conscious awareness for the rest of eternity. Now, believers of GSC fiercely argue that such a thing is completely impossible. As I've already stated, for them, a lack of experience is the equivalent of an experience of nothingness or dark oblivions. Well, now let's look at the GSC universe and let's see what happens to Thomas after he dies. So let's assume that Thomas is the only conscious being in the entire universe. So as you can see, after he dies, 1,000,000 years of total extinction pass by before an individual named General, that would be me of course, is born. So Thomas dies, 1,000,000 years go by, then General is born. So according to GSC, Thomas's conscious awareness would continue in General's brain. So there is a contradiction that is clearly present within the GSC universe. That would of course be the fact that after Thomas dies, there is a 1,000,000-year-long absence of experience. This is an absence of experience, just like there is an absence of experience in the atheist universe. So in both universes, the atheist universe and the GSC universe, there is a total absence of conscious awareness concerning Thomas's consciousness. In the atheist universe, this absence lasts an eternity, while in the GSC universe, it lasts for 1,000,000 years. So for the atheist universe, believers of GSC equated the absence of experience with an experience of a silent, total darkness. So going by their own logic, in the GSC universe, after Thomas dies, before he wakes up as general, he is first going to experience 1,000,000 years of silent, total darkness. Now, of course, I know exactly how believers of GSC are going to try to escape this grave that they have dug themselves into. They will mention how, from the subjective perspective of Thomas Clark, those 1,000,000 years will just pass by in an instant. From his perspective, he will experience a seamless transition from his previous life as Thomas to his next life as General. There is clearly something wrong with this counter-argument. Why do preachers and followers of the GSC religion put such a great emphasis on subjective experiences rather than objective reality? The subjective being what you feel happened, while the objective being what actually happened. I mean, just to give an example, if I were to go to sleep, yes, it is true that when I wake up, for me, it will feel like only a few seconds passed from after I fell asleep. But here's the thing, when I went to sleep, suppose that it was night time the day before, and then after I wake up, it is now morning the following day. That clearly indicates that I was actually asleep for hours, even if to me it felt like it lasted for just 2 seconds. So anyway, believers of GSC basically want to pretend as if these 1,000,000 years after Thomas dies just don't exist, but they do. In the GSC universe, after Thomas dies, 1,000,000 years pass before General is born. So the question that is being asked now is a very simple one. Within these 1,000,000 years, was there a lack of experience or not? Now, every single time a GSC believer opens their mouth to talk about GSC, they always have to mention the black void. The black void that atheists supposedly believe in. They are actually obsessed with the idea of a black void. Now, unfortunately for them, this stupid obsession with black voids has now backfired. So, believers of GSC are really left with no choice at this point. If they believe that an absence of experience in the GSC universe is not equivalent to an experience of a black void, then that forces them to admit that the same logic also applies to the absence of experience in the atheist universe. An absence of experience is really just that. It's an absence of experience. So, now that we are done with that, let's get back to the two arguments against GSC. Now, for the second argument, we'll show how GSC actually contradicts itself. And the reason why there's a problem is that any argument that contradicts itself is illogical, which means it is invalid. And then for the third argument, we're going to show how proponents of GSC might actually suggest that it doesn't matter if GSC contradicts itself, based on the claim that contradictions can in fact be allowed in logic, and we will disprove that as well. So beginning with the second argument, let us look back on the two models of consciousness that were introduced in part 1. So, first we had model 1. We stated that despite the fact that each brain is distinct, this distinctness is unable to keep consciousness distinct for each person. So despite the fact that there can be multiple brains, the consciousness is the same in each of them. And then for model 2, we stated that it is the opposite of model 1. Here, the distinctness of each brain is exactly what makes conscious awareness distinct for each person, right? The fact that there's multiple brains is actually what results in there being multiple consciousnesses. Now, it should be stated once again that there is no possibility for a third model of consciousness because consciousness exists inside brains. Each person has their own brain. This distinctness of brains can either keep conscious awareness itself distinct or it cannot. In the last video, I promised how I was now going to try to create a third model, specifically a GSC model of consciousness, in order to visually, illustrate how it contradicts itself. So basically, it would be a contradiction if a model of consciousness stated that the distinctness of brains is both able to keep consciousness distinct, but at the same time it is unable to do this. And in fact, that is exactly the contradiction made by the GSC model of consciousness. So let us actually now show what that looks like. So for the GSC model, we will use the same three characters from the scenario that I introduced back in part 1. So these three characters, if you remember, are the old man, the mother, and the baby. And so there's two events here, right? In the beginning, we only have two characters, one of the mother and the old man, and then the old man dies, and then afterwards the child is born. So for the GSC model, we will separate it into these two events, and it looks like this. In the before, as you can see, we have the mother. Both the old man and the mother are still alive, and the circles around them represent consciousness. So they each have their own distinct conscious awareness. And then this is the GSC model after. This is after the old man dies. You can see that X symbol on the old man that shows that this person is deceased. And now we can see the baby and the mother, and we can see that the mother has their own consciousness, but then the old man and the baby, they're both inside the same circle. So this represents that the consciousness that was in the old man is now continuing in the newborn baby. Now, at this point, I should note that I don't know exactly when consciousness emerges in the brain. I don't know if you only become conscious after you come out of the womb, or consciousness exists even before you are born. So just for the purposes of this video, we'll assume that you only gain consciousness after you are born. So we'll just assume that the baby only becomes conscious after it leaves its mother's womb and it opens its eyes for the first time. So just to recap, this second argument against GSC states that GSC contradicts itself. It does so by suggesting that the distinctness of each brain is simultaneously both able and unable to keep consciousness distinct for each person. This contradiction will be demonstrated with 3 examples based on the scenario illustrated involving our 3 characters in our GSC model of consciousness. So, example number 1. In the before scenario, we can see that the conscious awareness of the old man is distinct from that of the mother. So the conclusion that we can reach from this observation is that in the GSC model of consciousness, the distinctness of brains results in consciousness being distinct for each person. But now let's look at the after scenario. Here we can observe that the old man and the baby are now in the same circle. So this implies that the same conscious awareness that was in the distinct brain of the old man has now ended up in the distinct brain of the child. The conclusion that we can make from this observation is that the distinctness of brains is in fact unable to make conscious awareness distinct for each person. As you can see, the before scenario and the after scenario contradict each other. The conclusion we reached in the before scenario was that the distinctness of brains results in consciousness becoming distinct for each person, while the after scenario shows the complete opposite, which is that the distinctness of brains actually cannot make consciousness distinct for each person. Example number 2. This time we're only going to look at the after scenario. So in example 1, we showed how the after scenario contradicts the before. With example 2, we're actually going to see how the after also contradicts itself. So in the after, we can see that the same awareness from the distinct brain of the old man has now ended up in the distinct brain belonging to the child. The conclusion that we reach from this observation is that the distinctness of brains cannot keep consciousness distinct for each person. However, in this same after scenario, we can also see that the awareness that exists in the distinct child's brain is different from the conscious awareness that exists in the distinct brain of the mother. So the fact that the child and the mother each have their own consciousnesses leads us to conclude that the distinctness of brains actually causes consciousness to be different for each person. And so this contradicts the previous conclusion that we reached concerning the same after scenario in which the old man's brain could not keep his previous consciousness distinct from the one that is now in the child's brain. And so in this way, the after scenario not only contradicts the before, but it even contradicts itself. Example number 3. Now, for this example, it should be noted that proponents of GSC do not actually insist that after you die, your consciousness can only continue in a new, apparently, as I have actually heard several times, your consciousness can actually continue in an already existing brain. So taking this into account, we can prove that this too results in contradictions. Basically, we can just modify the current GSC model of consciousness in light of this new information. So all we have to do is just remove the baby from our case study, so that we're only left with the old man and the woman. Now, it should also be noted that it is quite unclear how exactly the consciousness from a previous brain now interacts with the consciousness that already exists in the new brain that it is inhabiting, right? Does the already existing consciousness get completely replaced with the new one? Do they coexist in the same brain, two consciousnesses in one brain, or do they sort of combine into a single new consciousness? Proponents of GSC do not really explain how this is supposed to work exactly, but in the end, it doesn't actually matter really what exactly happens, because in any case we still end up with a contradiction, which we will now demonstrate. So, as I said, we've removed the child, we just have old man and woman. So in the before, this is before the old man dies, his conscious awareness, as we can see, is distinct from that of the woman. So this observation implies that the distinctness of brains causes consciousness to be distinct for each person. In the after scenario, after the old man dies, his conscious awareness continues inside the woman's brain. Now, this observation leads to a conclusion that contradicts the one from the before scenario, because now we are left to conclude that the distinctness of brains is in fact completely unable to keep consciousness distinct for each person. So this is a blatant contradiction once again. Okay, so now that we've shown 3 examples that clearly demonstrate how GSC contradicts itself, I want us to actually compare the GSC model of consciousness to our own 2 previous models, Model 1 and Model 2. And basically, let's try to see if Model 1 and Model 2 also might result in their own contradictions. So just like with the GSC model, we are going to make use of the same 3 characters: the old man, the mother, and the child. So starting with Model 1, in the before, we can see how the mother and the old man share the same single universal conscious awareness. In the after scenario, the old man dies, the baby is born, but we can see that the baby doesn't get its own consciousness. It has the same universal conscious awareness that the mother has. So at Model 1, there is no contradiction, right? In both the before and the after, we reach the same conclusion, which is that the distinctness of brains cannot keep consciousness distinct for each person. So Model 1 is consistent with itself. Now let's look at Model 2. With Model 2, in the before, we can see that the mother has her own distinct consciousness, while the old man has his own distinct consciousness. In the after, the mother still has her own distinct consciousness. Now, recall the red ball analogy back in part 1. The old man's brain was responsible for creating his consciousness. Since his brain has died, that means his consciousness also disappears. So now you have the child brain that comes to life, and so it creates its own unique consciousness. So once again, there is no contradiction. The observations that we see in the before and after make us reach the same conclusion for both scenarios, which is that the distinctness of brains causes consciousness to be distinct for each person. So both Model 1 and Model 2 do not contradict themselves, as we have just demonstrated. Of the three models of consciousness, it is only the GSC model that does result in contradictions. And as I stated at the beginning of this video, any argument that contradicts itself is illogical and thus invalid. So because GSC results in contradictions, this means that it is false. Now let's move on to the third argument against GSC. So for this argument, we are going to disprove the very strange idea that God supposedly created logic, and that he can make logic behave in any way that he wants. So this means that God is the one who determines what is logical and what is illogical. Now, if this claim is true, it would indeed invalidate both of our previous arguments against GSC. It would, for example, disprove the Red Ball analogy by simply stating that, well, God can change the laws of logic so that the ball that disappeared from your left hand is still the same one that appears on your right hand. And then as for the other argument, which proves that GSC contradicts itself, proponents of GSC could simply say that God can change the laws of logic once again, so that now logic actually allows the existence of contradictions. Contradictions are no longer a problem within logic, so the GSC model of consciousness would still be able to work in reality, even if it results in contradictions. Now, as for who specifically came up with this rather bizarre claim that God created logic and he can modify it, was none other than Theodore Bolha. He has uploaded a video onto his channel titled "Why God Cannot Be Bound by Logic and the Implications That Follow." I'll add a link to the video down in the comment section. So, there are two claims here. The first is that God created logic, and the second claim is that he can modify logic. Both of these claims are false. So, I'll start with the first claim, which states that God can create logic. Now, we can easily disprove this claim by asking a simple question. Does God have to exist before he can create logic? The answer can be no, because a non-existent thing cannot do anything. So the answer to this question, for God to create logic, must he himself exist first? The answer here, it would be yes. God himself has to exist. So what does this tell us? Well, so if we can agree that yes, God has to exist first, it is an unbreakable rule that a creator must first exist in order to make a creation. That already implies the existence of a law of logic, which states that anything which begins to exist has a cause. So in other words, it is logic that dictates that God must first exist before he can attempt to create anything. This means that for God to create anything, he must follow what we might call laws of creation. So this means that before God tries to create logic, logic would already exist, preventing him from being able to create it since it's already there. As a matter of fact, not only can God not be responsible for the existence of logic, but logic would be responsible for God's existence if he exists. This is because it is logic that dictates the rules that must be followed for anything to exist in the first place. This can be demonstrated with the 4 different laws of logic concerning creation. If God cannot come from nothing, it is because logic states that something cannot come from nothing. If God cannot create himself, it is because logic states that something cannot create itself. If God was created by something else, it is because logic states that anything that begins to exist must have a creator. If God has always existed, if God was never created by anything because he has always existed, once again, it is because logic states that something can indeed not have a creator only if it never began to exist. It has always existed. Once again, it doesn't really matter whether it's God or it's you or me and any other living things or non-living things. For anything to exist, it has to first satisfy the conditions that logic requires. Just to merely exist requires that one obeys logic. And so God obeys logic just by existing. And so in this way, it just begs the question, how can you create something that not only already exists, but is also responsible for your own existence? Now, moving on to Theodore's second claim, he states that God can modify logic. Now, for this claim, and even the previous one, which states that God can create logic, he defends both of them with the simple argument that God is omnipotent. So, God can do things that are illogical simply because he can do anything. And of course, when we talk about God doing things that are illogical, we mean literally anything that is illogical. God can change the laws of logic so that 1 + 1 = 3. That is what Theodore is suggesting. And so, just like I said, the justification for this strange idea, it isn't any kind of complicated physics equations. It's just a very simple statement that God is all powerful. He can do anything. So there's this wonderful quote here by Voltaire. He says, "If you wish to converse with me, define your terms." So basically, if you present an argument, you want to make sure that you make it very clear exactly what you mean, so there's absolutely no confusion. So let's try to understand what exactly it means to be omnipotent or powerful, being able to do anything. Well, in order to answer the question of what it means to be capable of performing any and all actions, well, we need to ask the question of, what are the different types of actions? Well, firstly, there are actions that are logically possible. And then, secondly, there are actions that are logically impossible. That's it. There are no other types of actions. Something is either possible or it's not. Something either obeys logic or it defies logic. So when we say that God is omnipotent, He's all powerful, He can do anything, what we are basically saying is that He can do any and all things that are both logically possible and logically impossible. So based on this clarification, we can now reinterpret, or at least properly understand Theodore's argument. So his argument originally says that God can do things that are logically impossible because He is omnipotent, or that He can do anything. Well, since we now know what that means, what he is saying, in other words, is that God can do things that are logically impossible because He can do things that are logically impossible and things that are logically possible. When you state that God can do anything, you are already implying that He can do things that are illogical. Basically, He's not actually answering the question. His argument is really just a repetition of the premise. So he has made a claim without evidence. And here's another quote by Christopher Hitchens: "What can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence." And so in that way, we can dismiss the baseless claim that God can create logic and also modify it. So this means that our two previous arguments against GSC remain valid. The first argument being the red ball analogy, while the second one demonstrates that GSC contradicts itself. So the conclusion here is crystal clear. If naturalism is true, then generic subjective continuity is completely false. When you die, that's the end. And thank goodness for that. Speaking of the end, this video has also come to an end. So, as always, thank you for watching.